the kind of person the author of Hebrews might have been?
Probably a Jewish Christian rather than Gentile Christian, simply because of his, familiarity with. She asked if we have any idea what kind of person the author to the Hebrews was. Nothing other really than what you might infer from the text itself.
The writing is very sublime and it's very, it's
almost mystical. Huh? Yeah, almost mystical. Yeah, yeah. Okay. With all of that introduction, really by way of St. Paul, and I really wanted to, I don't think that was wasted time. I think it was an important thing to recognize that our first documents about the passion and death of Jesus are not the Gospels. Our first documents really are the writings of Paul. Even if even if Paul does not tell the story, he is certainly affirming what the Gospel writers then tell in the form of a story. And it's very likely that Paul himself, when he was teaching, was telling these stories. But he didn't see the need to repeat those stories, with one exception. He didn't see the need to repeat those stories in his in his letters. That one exception is the institution of the Eucharist at the Last Supper, when he says too, here's what I handed on to you, that Jesus, the night before he died, took bread, and so on. That's the one story that he tells. Now, let's see if we can begin this evening, at least with what actually happens in the Garden of Gethsemane. Actually, whether it's a garden or not, it seems to be only in John's Gospel. You see over there on the right, chapter 18, verse 1, they went across the Kidron Valley where there was a garden which he and his disciples entered. It's interesting, on the others, it says, you look parallel across the page there, on the Synoptic Gospels, the first three, it says, he went to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. Now, interesting that John's Gospel would say garden and the rest don't. And John's Gospel does not say the Mount of Olives, and the rest do. Now, it is true. You go to Jerusalem, and there is a place called Gethsemane, which means a place of a oil press. There are olive groves there. There were certainly olive groves on the Mount of Olives. That was also the place where there was a tradition that the Messiah would appear to overcome the enemies of the Jews. So there seems to be a certain significance to this going to the Mount of Olives to begin his passion. Now, John's Gospel, remember how John's Gospel begins. It begins with essentially alluding to the first verse of Genesis. In the beginning. In Genesis, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word, says John. And where were Adam and Eve when they fell? In the garden. And so there seems to be a certain logical connection there, that now Jesus is entering the garden. This is only in John's Gospel. Now remember, John was written a long time later, after a lot of reflection. So what we often see in John's Gospel is the fruit of reflection, making connections, sort of putting things together, putting two and two together in ways that the other Gospels don't always do. So, Jesus enters the garden as the beginning of undoing what was done originally in the garden. So, John seems to be making that connection. Now, interestingly, we have the prediction of Peter's denial. Mark's Gospel, the very first one to be written, places Jesus' prediction of the denial of Peter as they were on the way to that place called Gethsemane. And Matthew follows suit. Luke doesn't seem to like that. Luke changes it and puts it back right next to the betrayal, the prediction of the betrayal of Judas at the Last Supper. That's why on Luke's account there, I put the prediction of Peter's betrayal, Peter's denial, I should say, in italics there. That's happening a little bit before. Actually, I should have done the same thing with John's Gospel, because Peter's denial is predicted way, way back at the beginning of the Last Supper, right after Jesus gives them the new commandment, and right after he washes their feet and predicts Judas's betrayal. Now, one of the reasons that's given for this is that notice Mark is very hard on Peter. Matthew is very hard on Peter. Peter said to him, "Even though all become deserters, I will not." Actually, you look through the Gospel of Mark, and Mark doesn't have one nice thing to say about any of the apostles. Particularly here, Peter. Matthew softens that somewhat, but he follows along with that a lot. The disciples never quite seemed to get it, and Peter was the main one that with all of the wonderful stuff that Jesus was doing, especially for Peter, giving him the keys of the kingdom and all of that, he turns right around and does stupid things. Luke is not nearly so hard on the disciples. Almost everything from Mark, where Mark is harsh, Luke in some ways softens it. And we see that happening here. Luke does not seem to like conflict between Jesus and his disciples. And so he even is much nicer about them when we come to their abandoning him after the arrest in the garden. So what does he say? He says, "Simon, listen, Satan has demanded to sift all of you like wheat. But I have prayed to you that your own faith may not fail. And you, once you have turned back, strengthen your brothers." And then, he can't avoid having what Simon Peter says, "Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death." And then Jesus says, "I tell you, Peter, the cock will not crow this day until you have denied 3 times that you know me." So, again, each gospel has its slightly different flavor in telling that in accord with its own purpose.